What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update video for Colony Ship. If you're unaware, this is a CRPG that released into early access. I believe it was April of last year, actually. If you want to get specific, though the video title is probably something like a year in early access. But the reason we're doing this update video is because when the game launched into early access, I of course did a checkout video. The channel was much smaller then, but also I had not actually played the studio behind the game's first game. Iron Tower Studios made another game before this called Age of Decadence, which is a bit of a niche sort of cult classic type of game. And when Colony Ship released, I was like, I want to check out their previous work, which will help me inform this. But because it was in early access, I just wasn't in much of a hurry, frankly. Hence the year later. So I've finally checked out Age of Decadence, and I wanted to revisit Colony Ship and just sort of talk about it and some of the differences that have been made. So for starters, if you're coming straight from Age of Decadence, just visually, the game is a huge improvement. It looks much more modern. A lot of the UI and the inventory just looks a lot better. It's much easier to read. But before we dive too far into all of that, I did want to mention that if you're unaware, the story of Colony Ship is really cool. Essentially, you are on a floating generational ship that is headed to another galaxy. You were born on the ship, you're going to die on the ship, along with several other generations, because the trip's going to take something like 300-400 years. And because of this, a sort of interesting society has formed on said ship, but basically the ship's purpose was to head to this other galaxy on a sort of holy mission. However, as you might imagine, several generations later, who are just on the ship and are forced to live this way, has created a lot of sort of factional disputes and control of different areas of the ship, and overall just a very cool setting to work with. One of the most notable differences you'll find right away, especially if you're jumping into this game for the first time, either from Age of Decadence or just haven't played in a while since early access dropped, they've actually added 2 difficulties. So you have the default, which is Underdog, and Hero, which is the new easy mode. What Hero mode does is it makes the combat a little easier. One of the big complaints you'll see about Age of Decadence is that the combat is very clunky and not a lot of people enjoyed it. And while I thought it was pretty okay, it wasn't a huge focus of the first game, frankly. But the aim of Hero mode is to make that combat a little easier, whereas on Underdog, you're going to be fighting enemies who are better equipped and often outnumber you. And again, Hero just sort of weights things in your favor, but much of the rest of the game still remains the same, but you will have things like more skill points, etc. to work with. Now, I would caution you though, if you're unfamiliar with the type of game this is, it's a pretty niche RPG. So even in Hero mode, you honestly might still find the combat especially challenging compared to a lot of other games. And if you're not engaging with the systems, you're likely to still lose. So even if you have it on Hero mode, just make sure you're actively engaging with the systems. But it should be a little less RNG heavy as long as you're actually trying to build a character and do all the things you would normally do. Now, another big progress update, if you will, when it comes to early access is that they have added a ton of areas to the game. With the original early access launch, it was pretty much just the first couple of levels, whereas now we have access to all sorts of parts of the game, including a bunch of cool new locations such as hydroponics, where all of the ship's food's grown, of course, as again, we're surviving for generations here, so crops, etc. are being grown and experimented on. And something I find interesting is that you'll notice that some of these factions and groups you interact with in these new areas still have their eye on the big prize, which is this new galaxy, which I thought was a nice touch. I was curious how much that was actually going to come into play, but it's really cool to see some of these factions actually talk about running experiments and doing everything they can right now to make the eventual arrival on a planet much easier for them, even if it is still a few generations away. As of right now, though, there is still pretty substantial portions of the game missing. You can't play through the entire story or anything like that. They are shooting for, I believe, a 2023 June release, and every couple of months they are adding new areas and content until they actually get there. But talking a bit more about some of the things that have changed specifically from Age of Decadence is the character creator. I am a big fan of the improvements they've made here. The core concept of Age of Decadence is still here in that you'll pick your base stats, which will then inform some of your abilities and skill points, tagged skills, all that jazz. Then you'll pick a few tagged skills, which will increase the starting level of a few skills, depending on your intelligence modifier. Overall, the amount of skills was a bit trimmed down from Age of Decadence as well, which I think was the smart move because as I talked about in my review of that game, there was quite a few skills that didn't see a lot of representation. So I think cutting that list down and focusing more on things that will be used often is the right move. But there is still a decent amount of variety here. But probably the biggest addition to character creation, at least, is the feats. Now, this has been in early access for a while, but it wasn't in Age of Decadence, which is why I'm talking about it. Now, honestly, nothing crazy here. We've seen it in a lot of other games, but I think it adds a lot to this particular style of game because a lot of these feats have huge impact, such as boosting various skills, action points, all that jazz, basically just making you more efficient at the things you do, and honestly, making more interesting builds as a result, which is always good. Now, when it comes to the skills in particular, another big change from Age of Decadence is that there is still level by doing, but it works a bit differently. So in Age of Decadence, whether you used either a combat or civil skill in conversation or combat, of course, the game would then reward you with either combat or civil skill points for you to then distribute as you please. Whereas in this particular game, each individual skill has its own sort of experience bar, and as you use them and pass checks with them, you'll earn experience for that skill, which will then level that skill up specifically. So the core of that system remains the same, but the specifics have changed a little bit. Now, when it comes to combat, again, mostly what we see here is an improvement when it just comes to the UI and the overall presentation of combat, but it's an action point turn-based system, and if you're familiar with that, you'll kind of get the gist. But something to keep in mind with combat in this particular game is that you are outnumbered and outgunned in most cases, which means if you want to excel at combat, you kind of really need to lean into it and build a character for combat, as you will typically only be given enough resources to go either combat or pure like charisma, talking people down, that kind of thing. So those are the big things I wanted to talk about in this more updated version on my thoughts on Colony Ship after playing Age of Decadence, but a few other things I wanted to mention that are more specific to Colony Ship just by itself are that the first area is really cool. You're in a place called the Pit, which is essentially a cargo hold of the ship. And you have to resolve a dispute between basically a local gang lord and a new mercenary that was hired to keep the peace. And just that actually sends you on a lot of cool missions, kind of dealing with either side of those things, and you get a lot of options to resolve various situations. And I think that part is really well done. And while it's a little early to say how the rest of the game is going to pan out, so far I'm liking what I'm seeing. Another thing to mention is that they've actually added a sort of more involved sneak mechanic, whereas in Age of Decadence, you just literally clicked the sneak option and it kind of did the work for you via text. In this particular game, when you choose to sneak, it will usually put you in like a sneak scenario that you will then have to actively sneak your way through, which I think is a really cool touch. And honestly just keeps the player more engaged in the action. And I'm hoping when it comes to a lot of other things that Age of Decadence again tended to relegate to text events will actually play out in actual gameplay, because I think that will go a long way for this game in particular. But to kind of wrap this video up and not go on for too long, my main takeaways for this video are two things. Colony Ship in its early access is shaping up very nicely. It has been in early access for quite some time, but Iron Tower Studios is a small indie developer that is focusing on a very niche RPG, so it's kind of expected for them to take a while. Secondly, is that this game is a drastic improvement from Age of Decadence, and while I still think the core of it is still not going to be for everybody, if you're into this type of game, I think they are doing a fantastic job of, again, just kind of advancing the mechanics and things they had going for them with Age of Decadence, and I think that's really going to sell Colony Ship. Which is why I'm personally, at least, looking forward to seeing them iterate and eventually release this title. Which, again, they're aiming for June of next year, 2023. But with all of that said, guys, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Maybe consider checking out Colony Ship in its early access period. But regardless of all that, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.